Okay, we'll make a start. And hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Master of Applied Finance. My name is Luke, and I'm a current student ambassador for the university, and I'm going to help out moderating the Master of Applied Finance webinar. So before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We pay our respect to them and their culture and elders past, present, and future. So today's session is about giving you a snapshot of the Master of Applied Finance at Macquarie University. So we're inviting you today to review about how a global financial career can sustain its relevance and value to a very changing world, especially following something like COVID-19. So through this webinar, you will discover how a postgraduate applied finance degree from the Macquarie Business School specifically can help equip you with the skills and knowledge needed to tackle businesses' uncertainty, especially post-COVID. So how this webinar will work today in terms of structure. First, you're going to hear a bit about Macquarie's specific Master of Applied Finance so that you get a good overview of the course. And then you will also hear from an alumni of the degree who will talk a bit about what he's doing now and how he's utilized those skills from the course. This will be followed by a moderated discussion with a few key questions, and then this will be completed by a Q&A session. So that reminds you that anyone who's listening live, you can always put in your questions. So as a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers, if you do have any questions, like I mentioned, you can always put it in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screens. This session is being recorded, so if you do miss out on anything or if you'd like to watch this again, we will be sharing it to you after the event. And if we do run out of time and you still had a few more questions that quite weren't answered, you can always book a one-on-one personal consultation with the Future Students team. And I'll talk a bit about that at the end of the session. So today we are very lucky to be joined by Lindsay Bryan, who is the Director of the Applied Finance Centre at the Macquarie Business School, and also by a 2006 Master of Applied Finance alumni, David So, who is the current Director at Society General Corporate and Investment Banking, and he's the Director in the Debt Capital Markets Group. So to get us started today, I will pass it over to Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Luke. I am here, don't worry. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone and welcome to this session. So I'm Lindsay Bryan, Director of Postgraduate Applied Finance courses in the Macquarie Business School. And in talking about our courses, I'd like to start with a scenario which anyone in business could encounter on any particular day. So let's have a look at this. Let's just say you work in a finance role in a very busy company, which has a number of transactions on the go. Your role is to support the CEO and board in assessing finance and risk. It has been a very busy and difficult time for your company. Obviously, there's a lot going on with the pandemic and a lot of businesses are really struggling. So the CEO appears at your desk and says, "This Jensen financing proposal, should we do it?" What do? Because you're swamped with work, you're not sure about all the details, you've got a lot going on, and you know that an answer is needed. How do you ensure that you can add value to your firm? The fortunate thing is you've studied applied finance at Macquarie Business School, and that means that you have technical know-how, tools and skills to be able to confidently review the available information, apply all the relevant theories, tools and techniques, and then make a recommendation. You're also able to apply your expert knowledge, which goes beyond knowing just how to calculate the net present value of the financing transaction. Answering the CEO with the NPV is positive is not going to be sufficient. Completing our courses allow you to be an authority or a problem solver for the future. The CEO is actually asking for your professional judgment based on the analysis you completed together with risk, social, ethical and conduct issues which may intersect with the proposal. He's also looking for you to be able to be put together a team to research the proposal, analyse the data, and then work effectively as a team to think creatively and develop the proposal and recommendation. And that will ensure that you and your team are using the latest information, techniques, and tools to make that assessment, and always keeping up with new developments in your field. So what the Master of Applied Finance will do is to give you the key skills for today and tomorrow so that you can make an impact in your chosen field, so that you're able to use the power of us to shape the business world, as it says in our website. So let me just, whoops, sorry, wrong thing. Okay. Let me just say thank you for attending today, a welcome, and I look forward to having your questions, and I'll pass back to Luke so that we can introduce our alumni.
Thank you, Lindsay, and it's really great to hear that really practical way that students might be able to apply that degree. And yes, now I'm going to pass it over to David So, who will give the perspective from alumni from the Macquarie University Business School to talk about his professional background and how he's utilised the skills he's learned from his studies.
Thanks, Luke. And thanks, Lindsay, for the invitation. Can I check if you can hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you, David.
Great. And is the video working on your end? Can you see me as well?
Looks fantastic.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. No, thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the audience for dialing in. I'll keep it short on my end. Maybe just a quick introduction as to my professional background, and then a quick comment on my time at Macquarie in the postgraduate course. What were the sort of experiences, etc. from that. And obviously we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A if any of those you want to direct my way as well. So as a snapshot, I currently work for Societe Generale, which is one of the 30 global systemically important institutions, and it's one of the largest French banks in the world. So I work within the corporate and institutional bank, and specifically within the investment banking division. I'm actually based in Singapore, but as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm historically based in Australia. And I work within the debt capital markets team. Happy to take questions on that later as well. But essentially, for Societe Generale and in Australia, more importantly, we are sort of focused on wholesale, corporate, institutional business. So anywhere from financing, infrastructure projects, toll roads, metals and mining, energy, capital markets. That's historically where we're focused, and myself am focused more on the capital markets side. So taking corporates and institutions to the global bond markets to assist with their debt raising requirements. So that's a little bit about my professional background. I've been doing this for approximately 15 years. Before that, I was in accountancy. And I would say that in terms of my time at Macquarie, thanks Luke for the introduction as well. So I embarked upon a postgraduate course with Macquarie via the Master of Applied Finance in 2004, and I received my postgraduate degree in 2006. So I did the degree part-time whilst I was working, and back then. In the early 2000s, we were just coming off the tech industry sort of transitioning out of what was, pretty sort of fast-paced sort of boom that was coming off. At the same time, financial deregulation was occurring. So I really looked to the Macquarie postgraduate course as a way to perhaps understand a bit better the theoretical, but also the practical applications of applied finance across different disciplines. And that was the appeal for me. The fact that I could pursue the course part-time was also giving some flexibility, because at the time I was working full-time for one of the accounting firms. So for me, I can go into more detail, but for me the biggest memories and the biggest sort of draw cards were, first of all, clearly the history behind the program. It had a longer history than any other applied finance program that I was aware of. The quality of the curriculum, and also the professors and the faculty, which were clearly a very good mix of academia, but also, real world practitioners as well. And I came into the course pretty junior, pretty inexperienced, and I was mixing with classmates that were in some cases many years more experienced than I was in the professional world. So there was a lot of networking benefits to that as well. A lot of educational benefits to being sort of surrounded by peers that were in industries that were of interest as well. So in a nutshell, those were the reasons behind choosing Macquarie. I got a lot of value from doing it part-time as well. That gave me a lot of flexibility. The weekends, definitely, they're intense. You cram a lot in, but you're surrounded by people who are like-minded as well. So I think that those are key ingredients for success as well in that. So I think in a nutshell, those are sort of my considerations, and really happy to take questions at a subsequent point in time. But maybe Luke or Lindsay, if there's anything else I should cover, otherwise I'm happy to pause here as well.
Yep, thanks for that, David, for giving a bit more of an insight into your professional background. I think we'll move on to the moderated panel discussion, just so we can draw out a few more points that we often get students asking as the frequently asked questions. So the first points I'm moving to, and obviously COVID-19 is something that's on a lot of people's minds, but students and potential students are thinking about the future of work and how they are going to remain relevant. So what skills do professionals need to ensure that they do remain relevant? And how can this career in global finance sustain its relevance and value to the world following COVID? I think we'll go to you first, David, on that.
Sure, thanks, Luke. Well, I think, it's an interesting question because, how to sustain relevance, that's a key question in a normal environment, and you throw in how to do that in a COVID environment. That's an even more complex and difficult question. So I'll try to address it in sort of those two parts. I think relevance, and then drawing it back to the applied finance program. Clearly, relevance is going to be around subject matter, content, the appropriateness of the content, the accuracy of the content, and also just like anything in the world, like the way you deliver it. So what I'm seeing in today's market is that the need for information has never been greater, partly because there is so much out there, and there are so many complex factors at play when it comes to, if you're advising a client or you're dealing with colleagues. There are so many more factors at play that can influence a work stream or a project or a deliverable. We live in an environment where we're much more closely linked with other countries around the globe. We're much more influenced by, what US and China decide to do or not do can have impacts for us in Australia as well, around our policy, around our corporate environment, around our sort of immigration as well, which can influence asset prices. So I would say that, and just trying to draw this back to the applied finance, curriculum, you need to stay current, clearly. You need to have a curriculum that adopts and adapts, more importantly, to what the real world needs. And if I sort of think about the curriculum that I went through in the early 2000s and the curriculum that I can see sort of coming through more and more through the applied finance work streams and some of the topics and webinars, probably two things. One is ESG, sustainable, socially responsible practices. How does that influence company valuations, company practices? And then within that, a whole topic of itself is governance. We're very often reminded about governance in financial media, day in, day out, in the local publications, right? Whether it's Westpac this morning making that announcement, or others. So I think when you're sort of embarking upon choosing a postgraduate course, which is you're basically choosing an experience and an education. You do need something that adapts with the times. And,
Yep. That's a fair point, David. I think that's a really good coming from a professional's perspective. Maybe Lindsay, you want to weigh in on that curriculum side of things?
Sure. And one of the things I would say is that, reflecting on what David was just saying, and thanks for the comments there, David, is that when we started the Master of Applied Finance back in the mid-80s, there weren't many people who understood the nuts and bolts of finance, because it was all very new. And I think what's changed over time is that more and more people actually understand what's, the basics. It's how you apply it that is the most important thing. And one of the things that was always said to me about this course was that you could go to a lecture on a Thursday night and go to work the next day and apply what you'd learnt in your work. And so I think we need to bottle that and make sure that that keeps going. What's different now is that we're all having to be more adaptable, and we're having to do things that we've never done before. And look, we've done that too. We've had to transform our offering to online when everything has been done face-to-face traditionally. So everyone is going through these sorts of things, and it's do you have the skills to adapt? And one of the things we do want to make sure is that our students and whoever is doing the Master of Applied Finance is learning things that will be useful today and tomorrow, and to have those skills to communicate the work that they've done, to be able to understand what's happening with their business. And even with things like data analytics, you need to understand what it's telling you. So these are all things that we want to make sure that the students have. So the curriculum changes and bends and moves and is malleable to make sure that we are covering the things that people want to and need to understand for the future. And having those analytical skills, having the ability to communicate information in a succinct and simple way to all sorts of stakeholders is really important. And equally, to cover off on ESG, and particularly, the S and the G in these days. Originally, it was probably more focused on the E. These days, the S and G are very, very important too.
Great, that's great to hear that, Lindsay. We've got another big question we hear is that a lot of students, they love these theories and practices that you do talk about, that the curriculum at Macquarie does offer. And maybe it might be great if you could provide an example of where these theories can be applied to this post-COVID situation and how it's been very practical in its application. Maybe Lindsay, you want to go first on that, and then David weigh in on from a professional's point of view?
Sure. I think one of the most basic elements is if you look at the reaction of a lot of companies to COVID-19 and the onset of the pandemic, and certainly with the lockdowns, is that a lot of these companies have seen their business literally shut down overnight. So they've got to make sure that they can survive a period of shutdown. And that means generally they're going to have to raise some funds from somewhere. Now, that whole decision about how you raise funds is at the heart of corporate finance. What should you do to raise funds? And what we have seen is a slightly different approach that a lot of companies have taken. Some have actually gone to equity markets to raise money. Others have gone to debt markets quite successfully. And it's interesting to see what are the factors behind that. And it's really important to understand what would drive a company to choose one or the other. And I'm confident that David can give some comments on that, because I'm sure he would have been kept busy with that in the last 6 months.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I think the corporate finance knowledge that you carry with you through the course is absolutely critical to what you see playing out since February, March. I mean, it's been, as Lindsay says, a rush for liquidity. It's been companies analysing very closely their access to liquidity via loan, bond, equity markets, and then very quickly with their advisors deciding what's the optimal outcome, what is the possible outcome in some cases during periods of peak stress, because you don't always have access to all the sources depending on your circumstance. So the whole balance sheet structure, the whole concept around financial instruments, the various types of financial instruments you have at your disposal as a treasurer, the asset and liability management part, the risk management part of a treasury function, which I remember doing, a module on that. those are things that we've been living and breathing for the last 6 months. And it's, yeah, I mean, as Lizzie says, very busy. It's a lot about managing. Asset growth clearly has suffered, in a COVID environment. That we're clearly not seeing the same loan growth, for banks or leasing companies or finance companies that we used to. But the liability structure has not changed. And so depending on your risk management profile leading into COVID, that's driven a lot of your strategy and response during COVID.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for those comments there. And it's good to hear that those skills are still applicable and they still do remain relevant, even with COVID going on. Now, within the finance industry, there's lots of talks about things becoming automated, about further dependency on artificial intelligence. We'll go to you first, David, but how is digital essentially changing the financial industry?
Sure. No, thanks, Luke. So I think digital, when it comes to capital markets, I would say that digital is increasingly noticeable because you've got a lot of counterparties that have arisen over the last few years that are looking to perhaps disrupt a certain workflow, embed themselves into a certain workflow where banks either don't have the bandwidth to, or regulation has created constraints around them as to what they can do with some of the workflow processes. So I would say we see digital not so much as a competition at this stage. At this stage, I'll say. Well, I think obviously you keep an eye on all things digital because that obviously is that impacting the way jobs are being done, the way certain processes are being done. But for now, the drive towards digital has been more around increasing the robust and sort of efficiencies of certain work streams, taking out the human error, to the extent there was. Maybe just to put some examples around it. So we have, in the debt markets, we have a historic sort of broker-dealer model where you have, on the one side, counterparties that need funding, you have investors that need to invest, you have broker-dealers in between that arrange the transactions. But there are, over the last few years, some counterparties that have developed to maybe offer a more digital platform for these counterparties to be sort of matched. But that's increasing the speed, the efficiency of capital market transactions. In the end, you do still need, for now, arrangers to play that role. So I think digital, for now, I would say, is still something we see as complementary and enhancing the effectiveness of the work. Obviously, you see in other parts of banking, digital playing out in different ways. You have digital banks moving away from traditional bricks and mortar. You see corporates that are moving into credit card payments, into banking payments as well. I see less of that through my current professional background, so I can't comment on that. But I would say digital for now, in my opinion, I view that in the lens of complementary, increasing the efficiency, removing errors, hopefully supporting more business in that regard as well.
Thanks, David. Maybe you can weigh in on this, Lindsay, and maybe talk about units that Macquarie offers that cover this area.
Yeah, and look, I think it's an important point to remember in that my background is in financial markets, and I go back to the days when the foreign exchange desk had 9 traders and lots of people running around with pieces of paper, and these days it's more or less electronic. There wouldn't be many traders anymore, and they all just spend their time trading on screens. And I think that is a change that has happened, which is incorporated into the course, in that we're using many more tools than we used to help with analytics and to help analyze positions and products. If I look at the risk management side, There was a time when no one really considered using Monte Carlo simulation because it was computationally heavy, it was really difficult to organize, and you needed a lot of grunt in your computers. It's a lot easier to do that these days. And it's got to the stage now in financial markets where a lot of the shortcuts and the heuristics we use are not being used anymore because everyone knows that they can calculate using a very large model exactly what they want to know. So, it has changed dramatically the way that we approach things. We're using a lot more technology in our corporate finance classes. We're using them throughout all of our units where there's a lot more technology used. Not to mention the fact that, for the last 2 terms, we have been online. And that is a technology change in itself, where previously you haven't really been able to have an interactive environment or experience, whereas we've been able to achieve that using the technology that is now available.
Great. And that's great to hear that that does continue even during these uncertain times. Just go to you, David, but we always get a few questions from students wondering, especially from a professional, about what are the current or the financial trends for the next year.
Sure. Yeah. Financial trends. The ESG topic was mentioned earlier. That is something I don't think you can scroll through LinkedIn these days without seeing, a new post, a new development, a new agreement, being signed around that. So I think that's something that it started years ago, but the momentum has really caught up in the last 12 months, and you can really see that. It was driven traditionally out of Paris, by virtue of a lot of the government accords that were signed. But it's filtered through to how companies want to conduct themselves as well. So it's not just, as Lindsay says, not just the E, the environmental, but it's also the S and the G these days as well. So I think that of itself, for students that are thinking about the different fields, different lines of work, we've seen a lot of growth in that sector. That's clearly very obvious, and it's something that wasn't really apparent to me 5 years ago, but it's much more apparent in the last, let's say, 12 to 24 months. So a whole new industry is developed and coming about because of stakeholders demand it, shareholders demand it, investors in fund managers demand it, investors in banks demand it. So it's something you can't avoid. You need stewards that will direct where investors invest their funds. You'll need investor relations teams that can effectively communicate a corporate sustainability policy to equity and debt holders. You'll need analysts within the buy side that are equipped to rate and analyze a company on ESG factors, in addition to traditionally your equity analysts and your credit analysts as well. So for me, I would say hands down ESG is the number one trend. If you can call it a trend, it's been around for a while, but it's the part of the industry within finance that I see continuing to grow and gaining a lot of momentum globally and locally in Australia as well.
Thanks for those comments, David. We'll move into some of the Q&A questions because I see they're piling up a bit, and there's a lot of very interested and curious viewers. So if you do have any further questions, you can always continue to put it in while we still have and maintain this discussion. But for you, Lindsay, we have a few questions on people asking about how will this course be run, especially in 2021, given the current situation. Maybe you can talk about what type of flexibility options are on offer.
Well, look, I'd have to say that, if I think back on my experience, and David's will be no different either, we very much got used to the idea that we were working face-to-face for the lectures. We'd be spending a weekend or a couple of weekends a term or semester at Macquarie Uni, and we just had to get used to that. Now, obviously, once the pandemic hit, that all changed, and within a couple of weeks, we had to shift everything online. So at the moment, we have been operating completely online. Our borders are closed, so obviously no one can can get here to attend face-to-face classes. And then in the case of Melbourne, they've been in lockdown, so we haven't been able to have face-to-face classes there either. What we have done, and we did this weekend, is we had a class where there were a number of students in the class, and then there were also a number of students online via a Zoom call. And we managed to have 2 3-hour sessions over that weekend where everyone was able to join in, whether it was from the classroom or whether it was from their own home, and have an interactive experience in examining risk management. So that is probably a model which works quite well for the future, and one that we would like to have more often. So I think in 2021, we definitely want to see, if we can, more face-to-face classes, but equally we want to provide options for people who either are unable to make it to a face-to-face class or aren't in a position to actually get here to do that. So whether they might be located elsewhere. So equally, you know, this may open up opportunities for to make units available to people in other states and other countries as well. So there's a lot of scope there to provide that environment, but it doesn't actually mean anything unless we're providing that interactive experience for the students, and unless that, you know, they feel that they are part of the group and they're learning from their peers as much as they are from the lecturers.
That's great to hear. And so if a student is internationally located, they do have that ability to still interact interactively with the course.
Absolutely. And we currently have students in Chile, in Vietnam, China, wherever it might be, and they are still able to join in and can continue their degree.
Great. Thanks for that, Lindsay. A question for you here, David. You mentioned about regulation and deregulation. How do you see this change as it is now? And can you share how you've applied what you've learned doing the degree into what you do every day?
Sure. So yeah, regulation really, at least in my working life, was really noticeable working through the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and then coming out of that. So the amount of regulation that banks have to contend with these days is incredible. They are perhaps one of the, and rightly so, they're one of the most highly regulated industries because they are dealing with, from the large corporates down to the retail depositors like us. So the regulation that we saw come into place after what was deemed to be, government bailouts and so on and so forth of institutions in the aftermath of the financial crisis, that has now resulted in continuous regulation, continuous updates, regulators that are doing their utmost to make sure that what happened before doesn't happen again. Banks will, be one of the best capitalized set of institutions going around. So the direct direction of that, probably more of the same. I can't see the world moving back to an environment where capital requirements are reduced. If anything, it's more about maintaining status quo or tweaking capital requirements to align with perhaps whatever agenda regulators are trying to drive on the asset side. So are you trying to drive a social agenda, an environmental agenda? Are you going to afford banks perhaps some capital relief for making certain type of eligible loans to certain communities, certain asset classes, renewable energy, things like that? So I think it's more of the same, but it's probably about aligning with the broader agenda for the regulator and for the economy as a whole. Yeah, and then look, bringing it back to the curriculum, I don't have in mind specifically the regulatory modules that I might have touched upon in my time at Macquarie, but clearly that for me is something that will continue to be a focus. We talked about trends before. We talked about things to look out for. Regulation drives industry as well. So, as a response to that, you will see new ways of doing business, new pockets of business arise from that as well. So, I think it's a very important topic to stay abreast of.
Thanks, David. And I hope that answers your question there. A question for you here, Lindsay, and people are wondering about, again, with this flexibility of the program, if they're a current professional, how would studying this degree work out in terms of studying full-time and part-time, and how would that change the length of the degree?
Sure, a really good question. And one of the reasons why we do get a lot of professionals doing this course is simply because it is designed to work in with your working week. So whenever there are lectures, we try to make sure that they are in the evening or on the weekends so that they don't interfere with the standard working week. And we do try to ensure that that the activities are all spaced out in a way that enables you to get through your course. In any of our terms, if you're doing a full unit, there's about 150 hours worth of work over 10 weeks. So you can work out, you need to contribute about 15 hours of work a week, whether it be lectures, your own revision, or just preparation for assignments. So, you know, you're really, it's up to you to manage your time, but what we do is try to make it as easy as possible by making sure that any contact hours are outside the normal working week. And that really works well for most of our students. In terms of part-time versus full-time, there's actually no restriction on whether you do that. That just speeds up the degree. If you were to do if you had a finance-related degree, you had the work experience, you could actually complete the degree full-time in a year. That's a pretty big commitment though, because that means that every term you're going to be doing about 30 hours of study a week. So most people don't do that. And so most people take the 2 years to do the part-time version of that course. And then if you don't have a finance degree and you want to get into and you have the work experience and you want to actually get into this course, then obviously it takes a little bit longer because you've got to actually do the foundation units that lead into it.
Thanks, Lindsay, and I hope that does clarify for everyone asking about that length of the degree. We only have time for a couple of more questions, so we'll move on to one that a lot of students do ask about: why Macquarie? And I guess maybe, David, you did talk about this a bit before, but why did you choose Macquarie? And then we'll get Lindsay's perspective on that as well.
Sure. Now, I think came down to, you know, pretty simple and I think pretty relatable considerations. You know, it came down to the brand. You know, when you choose something like this, you don't choose it lightly. It's a real commitment, both financially and time-wise as well. And you're doing this for the longer term. So you probably have a goal in mind that you want to, you know, move towards a certain occupation, or, you know, a certain industry, or you want to enhance your capabilities within your existing industry as well. So it came down to the track record that Macquarie had. That for me was very obvious. And then it came down to reference, word of mouth. You know, you do your diligence, you speak to others, you look at alumni that have come through before, that you have a chance to meet or, you know, talk to and hear from. And then you look at the curriculum. You know, is this something that I can commit to? Can I see myself sticking to this for the time required? And, you know, all those things sort of converged for me, and it was a clear yes. The time commitment is considerable, as Lindsay says. You do have to put in. You only get in as much as you put in to the coursework. You know, you could be a natural and you don't need to put in, and you can still get through the course. But are you really getting the experience? Is that what at the end of the day, what are you really paying for? You know, so you know, it's a few things, right? For me, but first of all, it's the experience, and of course the knowledge. The outcome obviously is something that has your name on it, and that you can carry with you. But the experience along the way is probably what sticks with you, and perhaps enhances you and pushes you in that right direction that you want to go to. So those are my considerations, Luke.
Lindsay, do you have any adding points there?
Well, I do. I mean, and obviously I'm not unbiased because A, I've done the degree, and B, I'm the one that runs it. So I need to make sure that I'm fully on board. But the one thing I do notice in talking to potential students and interviewing people, having discussions with them about where they want to take this, is that just about everyone that enters into the Master of Applied Finance has an idea about where they want to go. And where they want to go is a development beyond where they are now. So they have some experience and they want to take that further. And I think that that's the big thing, that you have that sort of desire to go somewhere to do something a little bit different, or a little bit more senior, a little bit more involved. And then you take the opportunities that the Master of Applied Finance gives you. And those opportunities come about because you're in a class with a bunch of people who have a similar outlook to you. They're looking for similar things. It won't be exactly the same. They won't be in the same industry, but by and large, they're wanting to go somewhere too. And equally, you're going to have academics and industry practitioners who are there to help you, give you the benefit of their experience and give you that opportunity to try things out, and then understand what you can and can't do in business, in finance, and then go and deliver that and use it in your work. And I think that it's those opportunities that it provides to you that give you the chance to go beyond that. And one of the things I notice is that people often tell me that having the Master of Applied Finance has actually helped them get to their next career stage. Having it has given them the confidence and the ability to add value to their businesses and to do the things I talked about in the introduction, where you're not only just understanding how to do an MPV, but you understand how to actually use that when it comes to communicating to a board, senior management, CEO, or even investors.
Thanks, Lindsay. Another quick question for you about what is the requirements of enrolling in the course, and is there a minimum GPA?
Okay, so we don't actually have a minimum GPA for the course. We're actually more concerned with, do you have a finance degree, and that leads you down one path. But most importantly is the work experience. You've actually got to have a few years of work experience, preferably in some sort of professional environment where you are making decisions. So we're not talking about just working as on the sales counter of a department store. We're actually talking about you working in a business where you've got to make decisions on a regular basis. So that's a really important part. If you don't have a finance degree, that's not a drawback. If you've got a degree, we can convert that to a finance degree if you like. Equally, if you have lots of work experience, but you don't have a degree, we can also fix that too. We actually have a graduate certificate of finance that gives you the equivalent of a bachelor's, and then you can enroll in the Master of Applied Finance. So there are a number of different pathways you can take to get into the course, and I'm happy to speak to anyone who wants to talk about how they can do that.
Thanks, Lindsay. Our final question for today's webinar, and it'll be for both of you, but if students want to get the most out of their potential studies, what tips can you offer them? So we'll go to you first, David.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the temptation as a student is to rush to get to the end. We've all been there. So I think in hindsight, when you reflect upon sort of your own personal journey, when you go through these things, I think my only advice is, look for the application, the real world application, as Lindsay says, look for that. And that should become very obvious the way the course is designed. But then, I enjoy the experience. Don't rush it, because after all, that's what you take with you. It's not, you don't carry the piece of paper with you in your back pocket everywhere you go. You're carrying the experience and the network, the relationships, the knowledge. So I would say, focus on that. The rest will come. The curriculum is designed to facilitate certain questions. So participation is never, at least in my experience, it was never forced, but it was always encouraged. So I think that's each to their own, but that would be my sort of main comments to make.
And Lindsay?
Yeah, I always sort of talk about three things with new students, and the three things are commit, concentrate, and connect. And I think you've got to make that commitment to actually doing the work, and that means actually doing the work, not paying someone to do it for you. You've got to make sure that you actually do turn up to class, that you actually interact, and as David said, that you participate. The concentrate one is very important too, because things move at a fast pace. It's only 10 weeks for every unit. So you've really got to make sure that you are across everything in that time. So you don't want to rush it, but you also want to make sure that you are steadily building to the end of the unit. And then finally, the other one is connect. The connections are really, really important. Take the opportunity to connect with your lecturers, take the opportunity to connect with your fellow students, and also take the opportunities that are provided through the activities outside of classrooms. So there are many activities that are now being put on for students in both Master of Applied Finance and the MBA, and often together. So you get a chance to mingle with a group of students that you normally wouldn't get to see. Equally, we're putting on more and more networking activities online because that is the only way we can do them these days. We have a number of webinars where you can learn things about topics that are slightly different to what we teach, or maybe just topical and up to date with what's going on. And so you can look at the recent examples that we've had where we've talked about how you can use data in investments. We've looked at what the role of the fiduciary in investments is. We've also talked to Sydney Airport about what they've done with sustainability and how the impact of COVID has flown through to them. So there are many different ways you can connect, and you've got to make sure that you do that.
Yep, thank you for that, Lindsay. And this will wrap up today's webinar. So before we wrap up, if you do have any further questions, you can always reach out to the Future Student team and book a one-on-one consultation. Apart from that, thank you to both of our speakers for sharing their time and having a really insightful discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming along.